asesino. Y tú.
In the years since he took power, Fidel Castro has become an enemy of the United States. In the eyes of Washington, a threat to United States security in the Caribbean. A plan of action against him is drawn up. March 17, 1960. CIA Chief Allen Dulles is told secretly, organize a Cuban exile force. He is not told how the force is to be used. He is only told, get it ready. It is at this moment that the Soviet tanker Pekin slips quietly into Havana Harbor, carrying a cargo of crude oil that will set off a chain reaction. Castro orders Texaco, Shell, and Esso plants in Cuba to refine the Soviet oil. They refuse, and Castro seizes the refineries. He offers no reparations. Over angry Cuban protests, the United States retaliates by cutting off its imports of Cuban sugar. Castro seizes more United States property. Now, in the summer of 1960, the United States and Cuba have reached the point of no return. In Washington, the Eisenhower administration is now convinced it is in the United States' national interest to get rid of Fidel Castro. A few weeks later, the Democratic candidate for president is in New York campaigning. He issues a statement in which he says the United States is not doing enough for the Cuban exiles. He says the United States ought to help them. In their television debate, Vice President Nixon disagrees.
Now, I don't know what Senator Kennedy suggests when he says that we should help those who oppose the Castro regime, both in Cuba and without. But I do know this, that if we were to follow that recommendation, that we would lose all of our friends in Latin America, we would probably be condemned in the United Nations, and we would not accomplish our objective. I know something else. It would be an open invitation for Mr. Khrushchev to come in.
As the votes are counted on November 8th, it is clear that a key issue has been who knows best how to handle Castro. It is the closest presidential election in United States history.
But we finally emerged successfully. Now, as far as the next program, I went to the country with very clear views of what the United States ought to do in the 60s. I have been elected, and therefore I'm going to do my best to implement those views.
Even as the president-elect speaks, in Guatemala, the force that he has called for in his campaign, the force that Nixon has denied exists, that Eisenhower has created, that Castro has denounced, is getting trained and ready. Obviously, nothing official has ever been said about it. But from this perspective, certain facts are now apparent. On April 4th, the CIA urges the president to go ahead with the invasion. The Joint Chiefs agree, if the CIA estimate is correct, if the brigade has control of the air. Only Senate Foreign Relations Chairman Bright speaks out against the invasion, tells the president privately it is immoral, a mistake, it will fail. The decision can no longer be delayed. The president's experts have told him to go ahead. His staff has not argued against them. The decision is now his alone. He makes up his mind early on the morning of April 5th, 1961. Operation Pluto, the invasion of Cuba, is approved. Preparations for the invasion continue. From Texas, the United States U-2 takes off to photograph Castro Airfield. A United States Naval Task Force puts to sea for Caribbean maneuvers scheduled for the next week. United States Marines are at sea in transport to take part in the maneuvers. April 13th, at Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua, the Exile invasion fleet is loading. Havana, dawn, Saturday, April 15th. B-26 bombers of the Cuban Exile Air Force attack Castro's airfield. The UN, Saturday morning. Cuban Foreign Minister Raul Roa.
I have been instructed by the revolutionary government of Cuba to denounce before this committee the vandalistic aggression carried out today at dawn against the territorial integrity and political independence of Cuba. The responsibility for this act of imperialistic piracy falls squarely on the government of the United States of America.
Dr. Roa has made a number of charges that are without any foundation. I reject them categorically, and I should like to make several points quite clear to the committee. Regarding the two aircraft which landed in Florida today, they were piloted by Cuban Air Force pilots. These pilots and certain other crew members have apparently defected from Castro's tyranny. No United States personnel participated. No United States government airplanes of any kind participated. These two planes, to the best of our knowledge, were Castro's own Air Force planes, and according to the pilots, they took off from Castro's own Air Force field. I have here a picture of one of the planes. It has the markings of the Castro Air Force right on the tail, which everyone can see for himself.
One of the planes is at a Miami airfield. It is identified as a B-26 attached to the exiled Cuban brigade. Castro's B-26s have no nose guns. The pilot is identified from a newspaper picture as a member of the brigade. The airstrike he took part in was intended to destroy Castro's Air Force. Two more are planned. Castro has been dealt a serious blow, but his entire Air Force has not been destroyed. The crucial fact is 3 jet trainers are untouched.
Official United States propaganda.
The airstrike has humiliated the United States before the world. It has humiliated Adlai Stevenson, who did not know that what he told the UN was not the truth. The United States reacts to the world outcry against the bombing. The other 2 airstrikes are postponed. This decision leaves Castro with 3 undamaged jets. These jets will be a key to the failure of the invasion. Sunday, April 15th. The exile leaders do not know the invasion fleet is already at sea.
Me esperaron en Nueva York en la escalería del avión.
Awaiting me at the steps of the plane that brought me from Miami were 2 people who identified themselves as officials of the American agency. They took me to a private room, and in a short while, the other leaders of the Revolutionary Council arrived. From there, we entered 2 cars and were driven to Philadelphia, where we took an immigration department plane.
We arrived at an unoccupied airport somewhere in Florida. At that moment, we didn't know which airport it was. It was taken to a house and an armed guard was placed around.
For the next 48 hours, the Cuban exile leaders will be kept under guard in Florida, in this house, while 90 miles away, an invasion is being carried out in their name. Dawn, Monday, April 17th, Day of Pigs, Cuba. The first units of the brigade reached the beach without opposition. Among them is Humberto Diaz Aguirre of the 2nd Battalion, H Company.
This is the way the battle began at Playa Larga. 3 men went forward as an observers to look for militiamen. Suddenly, they found 2. They said, "Stop." The militiamen answered, "Stop." Then a soldier from the rear yelled, "We are an army of liberation. We came to fight communism." The militiamen answered, "Fatherland of death, long live Fidel Castro," and the shooting began.
You are looking at film shot on the invasion beach by German and Cuban cameramen. In Havana, as the morning goes on, Castro begins to react to the invasion. Those who can be trusted are armed. Castro takes personal command. The roads out of Havana are clogged with troops moving up to the invasion beat. But in the first hours, the brigade pushes inland. Castro has not yet been able to bring up his tanks and heavy guns. The first communique of the brigade, issued by a Madison Avenue Public Relations office, reports satisfactory progress. Over the beach are 12 B-26s providing air cover. Shortly after dawn, they are attacked by the 3 Castro jets that survived Saturday's airstrike. 5 of them are shot down. The brigade's 2 supply ships and its communications ship are sunk. Within a few minutes, the men on the beach have lost their air cover and their supplies. Now, Castro can bring up his tanks without fear of air attack. And he can bring up thousands of his milicianos. By afternoon, Castro is pressing the brigade hard. How are they to survive? Where are they to get help? Some expect it to come from the underground. There is no uprising, there is no sabotage, there is no help from the underground for the brigade. For the next 48 hours, the men on the beach take a terrible pounding. They wait for help. None comes. They say they have been promised air support by their American advisors. Washington says none was ever promised. Only one thing is clear. The brigade is being driven into the sea. Its only hope of survival is United States military intervention. The failure at the Bay of Pigs was not merely the failure of the Cuban exiles. It was a failure of United States policy, which led to a failure of United States power. Clearly, the United States had the naked power to destroy Castro, but it could not ignore world opinion and use this power. It could not risk the repercussions that might follow the slaughter of Cubans and the occupation of Cuba by United States forces, could not risk the possible escalation to nuclear war. One alternative that suggested itself was indirect intervention, carried out secretly under CIA supervision. The CIA's solution was a carefully controlled military operation. It ignored, for the most part, the underground inside Cuba, which could not be controlled. Left-wing former Castro supporters, considered politically unreliable, were shut off from participation. No real effort was made to bring about an uprising of the Cuban people. The divided and mercurial Cuban exile leaders were felt to be undependable, and all real control was taken out of their hands. The CIA put its faith in the brigade, small, politically reliable, controlled by United States agents. An attempt was made to use the brigade and the Cubans as an instrument of United States policy. The tactics were reminiscent of the days of United States big stick diplomacy. But Fidel Castro did not collapse at the first sign of opposition, as many Latin American dictators in the past. As a result, the Cuban exile brigade was destroyed on the beach, while the Cuban exile leaders were held in CIA custody, and a United States task force stood by helplessly. This was probably the low point, the worst moment for John F. Kennedy in his 3 years in the White House. As president, he took full responsibility for this failure of United States policy, this misuse of United States power, although the total blame was clearly not his.